These are the terms from Unit 6, the Cold War and its aftermath. And there were three big things that went down during this time. The obvious one is the Cold War, where ideological and philosophical differences split the world in two, with the USA and the USSR being the superpowers that divided up the world. Democratization, we see a movement of countries opting for democratic forms of government to run themselves. And then former colonies becoming free, decolonization and independence. So the first word I need you to know is the arms race and the space race. And like I said a second ago, the USSR and the USA were the leaders in this divide between the communist world and the democratic capitalist world. And they were trying to get a leg up on each other. So when one nation would make a particular weapon, the other nation would make another weapon. Then that would go back and forth and back and forth, trying to outdo each other to the tune of enough weapons to blow up this world 400 times over. Now, similar to the arms race with weapons was the space race. So the Russians put Sputnik out. Then America has to, do this feat in space. And then the Russians would do one. And it went back and forth and back and forth. And I think this political cartoon of Khrushchev and Kennedy arm wrestling shows what was going on during this Cold War. Hey, I'm going to make more weapons than you. I'm going to have more accomplishments in space than you. Oh yeah, I'm going to outdo you. Back and forth, back and forth. And that was called the arms race and the space race. Now, during this time, we see civil disobedience. Now, civil disobedience was used by nations who were trying to shake off these big, powerful imperial powers. And it's a refusal to comply with the laws. And it worked. It worked. In class, I showed you a list of 198 non-violent techniques to defeat a more powerful nation. And it worked with great effectiveness with Gandhi in India, and with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement in the United States, and with Nelson Mandela fighting apartheid and the ANC fighting apartheid. So civil disobedience is when the collective citizenry, the collective people, will fight to get their rights. And this happened quite a bit during this time period in history. The Domino Theory. Now, the Domino Theory has been pretty much disproven, but at the time it was this idea in the West that thought if one nation became communist, the entire region would become communist. That's why America and its NATO allies, those other nations, fought in Korea to try to stop communism then and there. Then the same thing happened in Vietnam. Now, the reason why I said the Domino Theory was disproved was because after Vietnam, when the Americans left, there was this notion that the whole continent of Asia would turn communist, when in reality, after the Vietnam War, only Laos and Cambodia. But whether it's true or not at the time, men died over this theory. Billions of dollars were spent over this theory. So it was this notion, if one nation turned communist, the whole region will turn communist, we have to stop it. Containment, similar to the Domino Theory, it was an idea that said, okay, we're not going to stop communism, but we can contain it. If you cross that line, it's war. And this is, again, the reason we fought in Korea, the reason we fought in Vietnam. You draw the line. And this political cartoon is your choice. Where do you draw the line against communist aggression? And Western leaders had to ask themselves that question. And if you cross the line, it becomes violent. And it did. Cultural imperialism. Now, during this time, we see the West influencing other nations. So old-fashioned imperialism, where you show up in a boat and take people over, that doesn't really fly, especially toward the later portion of this era into the 80s and the 90s. So what happened was the West, using corporations, would try to westernize these people to sell Western products to the people, and it's called cultural imperialism. And again, here's Disney and Texaco and McDonald's and Microsoft, and just flooding the world with Western goods, Western culture. And this occurred in the latter half of this era. Globalization. During this era, the world truly became global, and you've been born into an era of remarkable globalization. You can play a video game against somebody from anywhere in the world. You get on Amazon, you can order something in the mail from anywhere in the world, but we see globalization really kicking in, especially at the latter part of this era, where with the internet, with the advent of the internet, and with technology and air travel and all those sorts of things, we live in a global world. And this happened during this time. Mutual assured destruction, MAD, and that's a pretty appropriate acronym because it's pretty crazy. This was the philosophy that I think prevented World War III, which prevented nuclear weapons being used against each other, because it's the idea that if I use nuclear weapons against you, my enemy will use nuclear weapons against me. Therefore, if I initiate a nuclear attack, I am committing suicide. Suicide is illogical. Therefore, we fought proxy wars. We fought traditional wars and didn't use nukes, because if we did, I think both sides had enough clarity of mind to realize this is suicide and we don't want to die. And it's a crazy, I was alive during this time. It was a crazy way to live. It was a scary way to live. So that philosophy is called mutual assured destruction. Brinkmanship. During this time, the USSR and the USA would be tough guys and push each other right to the limits. We're about to fight, and then it'd be a détente. It'd mellow out. Then it would happen again. We're going to push ourselves. We're about to do violence, Cuban Missile Crisis and whatnot, and then a détente. It would mellow out. And this went on back and forth. But again, it was a scary time, because living during that time, you were concerned that brinkmanship would cross the line into violence. And we came really close a couple times. But this philosophy of I cannot show weakness, I have to be a tough guy, I have to stand toe-to-toe with you, but at the same time I'm not going to pull the trigger and fight, that's brinkmanship. Decolonization. Decolonization happened where modern countries emerged from former colonies. So a couple eras ago I taught you that 94% of the African continent was conquered by imperial powers. Now, if you look at this map of Africa, you can see the years where these nations became free. And understanding our era began in 1945, just a quick glance, 56, 62, 51, 60, 60, 60, 60, 56, 60, 60, 60, okay, 75. You can see many nations became free, but I liken it to when you were on your own for the first time. So you have parents that care for you until you're an adult, then you go off into the world by yourself. It's hard. You make mistakes. You learn from those years, those early years, and these nations did as well. To be controlled by another nation and then to be free, they had to figure out how they were going to do business, how they were going to get along. It was a tough process for a lot of these nations. But the majority of them chose democracy. So these are interrelated. Decolonization, okay, I'm free. I have to figure out how to run myself. More nations chose democratic forms of government than communist forms of government. And this is called democratization. It was the process where nations, wrote constitutions and, developed parliaments and legislatures and that kind of thing. And in 1920, there were 15 democratic nations on planet Earth. Today, 2/3 of the world uses a form of democratic government to run their nations. So on a very simple level, in the Cold War, what philosophy won? Democracy or communism? I think the evidence is pretty strong to the point where democracy won. So these are the Unit 6 terms, and thank you for watching.